It looks more like a chain of tragic accidental circumstances, because Israeli plane did not take down our plane, but certainly we have to seriously look into it.
Russian President Vladimir Putin there speaking after Syria inadvertently shot down a Russian military plane, killing all 15 people on board. Now, earlier, Russia said Israel was to blame for putting the plane in the line of fire, even though it was Syrian forces who actually fired the shots. Why the blame game? Well, these lights streaking across the night sky. This video released by Syrian state media purportedly shows Syrian air defenses repelling an Israeli strike. Israel expressing sorrow about the loss of life, but says Syria, quote, fired indiscriminately and did not bother to ensure no Russian planes were in the air, end quote. Well, that's a deadly incident, highlighting the complex network of regional and global players, each taking a stake in Syria's war. I'm joined now by CNN's Matthew Chance. He's in Moscow for you, and our Arwa Damon, who is in Turkey. Let's just start with you in Moscow, Matthew. When we all first heard this story, it sounded very convoluted earlier on today, and Moscow pulling in the Israeli ambassador. Just peel the pieces apart here. I mean, I've explained what happened, but the kind of blame game that's going on, it does seem slightly remarkable.
Yeah, it does, although I think Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has moved to try and ratchet down the tensions that have been mounting between Russia and Israel because of this incident. Initially, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the loss of the 15 lives, the 15 Russian servicemen on board that Ilyushin 20 aircraft that was blown out of the sky by Syrian air defenses was as a result of Israel's careless actions. Of course, it came following an attack by Israeli warplanes on targets inside Syria in the scramble that was launched by the Syrian air defenses to intercept Israeli missiles. It seems that Russian plane was inadvertently taken down by one of the Syrian S-200 Soviet-era missile defenses. And, of course, that's led to an enormous amount of tension brewing between these two countries, Russia and Israel. Russia now, though, saying that it seems to have been like a chain of tragic accidental circumstances that led to this. And they're saying, of course, that the Israelis did not, bring it down themselves. Nevertheless, it underlines the confusion, underlines the breakdown in communications that happened clearly between the Israelis and the Russians. They've got deconfliction lines that should have been used to communicate the whereabouts of their various assets, but more importantly, perhaps a breakdown in communications between the Syrians and the Russians. They seem to have opened fire on these incoming Israeli missiles and accidentally shot this Russian plane out of the sky.
This just, less than 24 hours after we had a meeting in Sochi between the Russians and the Turks. Our Damascus itself welcoming a deal struck in Sochi between Russia and Turkey to create a demilitarized buffer zone in northwest Syria. Idlib province, of course, the last remaining major rebel stronghold where an all-out assault had been feared. Turkey says the diplomatic solution will prevent a humanitarian crisis on its borders. As you digest the news on this demilitarized zone and you assess the implications of what we've seen overnight with this downing of this Russian jet, where are we at this point?
We're in very uncertain and quite shaky territory, Becky. The critical thing is that humanitarian catastrophe that so many aid organizations and players were warning about, that we would see transpiring in Idlib province should a full-on assault have taken place there. That, at least for the time being, seems to have been averted, but I think for the time being is really the operative part of that sentence. Now, under this agreement, you would have Russian and Turkish technical advisors trying to demarcate exactly where this demilitarized zone is. It's expected to be about 15 to 20 kilometers wide. And under the agreement, as far as we understand it, the more extreme elements within the fighting force that is inside Idlib province would be pushed out of this zone along with any sort of heavy weaponry as well as tanks and other such military equipment. What we understand from the Turkish side is that the moderate rebels, as they call them, would be allowed to keep some of their lighter weaponry and civilians would be allowed to remain. But there's really a lot of uncertainty when you talk to the Syrian population inside the province, not the least because they've seen these types of agreements in the past and they have not necessarily held all that strongly. Idlib, if you will remember, was in fact a de-escalation zone, but at the same time it was still getting hit by a variety of different airstrikes. Sure. This is such an uncertain, volatile situation, Becky, and unfortunately the Syrian civilians know only too well that while these agreements take place, they don't really have that big of a voice at the negotiating table.
Matthew, Russia's entry into the Syrian conflict fundamentally changed the dynamic of what was then a sort of 4.5-year civil war. At this point, what is Russia's endgame here? And why does Russia need Syria? Just remind us of where that argument stands.
Well, I think its endgame is really the same as it was when they entered this conflict several years ago to bolster the forces of Bashar al-Assad, their Syrian ally, the Syrian government in that country. They've turned they've brought unprecedented firepower to that battlefield in the form of their air forces and missile strikes, which have turned the tables in that conflict and led to enormous reverses to the point where Idlib now, of course, is the last province that is held by the rebels against the Syrian government. And so, you know, this is a potentially crucial last moment. But the issue remains the same. This has demonstrated to the world and to itself that Russia is a major player once again on the international stage, that it can still shape the outcome of countries distant from its territory in the Middle East, in this case Syria, and that it is back as a military power. And that's the message Russia wanted to convey, I think, when it entered this conflict several years ago. And it's been very successful in achieving that aim.
Matthew's in Moscow for you, Arwa in Turkey. Both have been in and out of Syria over what has been this 7-year bloody war.